The rain was coming down in sheets as he trudged along the lonely highway, soaked to the bone and exhausted from hours of walking. His car had broken down miles back, and the nearest sign of civilization was this small, seemingly abandoned town that had just appeared in the mist. The traveler pulled his jacket tighter around him, shivering as the chill set in. The town's welcome sign was barely visible through the fog, "Welcome to Hallow's End." It looked like any other sleepy village, but something felt off, eerily off. As he stepped onto the main street, the silence was overwhelming. No sounds of life, no distant hum of traffic, not even the rustling of leaves. The buildings were old, their wooden facades worn and weather-beaten. Lights flickered inside some of the windows, casting strange, distorted shadows. The traveler glanced around, expecting someone, anyone, to greet him or at least notice his arrival, but the town seemed deserted. He shook off the feeling, attributing it to his exhaustion, and decided to find shelter from the storm. He walked past a row of quaint houses, each with its own little porch and rocking chair, but all unoccupied. The only sound was the rain pattering against the cobblestones, a sound that seemed amplified in the eerie stillness. As he reached the end of the street, he spotted a small inn with a dim light glowing in the window. Relieved, he made his way over and pushed the door open, a loud creak echoing into the silence. Inside, the inn was warm but strangely empty. A fire crackled in the hearth, but there was no one at the front desk. "Hello?" he called out, his voice breaking the silence like a clap of thunder. He waited, but there was no response, just the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. The traveler felt a shiver crawl down his spine, a sense of being watched. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought, and decided to check upstairs for someone, anyone. As he ascended the narrow staircase, he could feel the tension in the air grow thicker with each step. The hallway was dimly lit, doors lining both sides, all closed. He paused at the top, listening for any signs of life, but there was nothing, just the heavy silence pressing in around him. His heart began to race, and he felt a pang of unease. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. But as he turned to head back downstairs, he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper coming from one of the rooms at the far end of the hall. The traveler froze, his breath caught in his throat. He knew he should leave, but something drew him towards the sound, a morbid curiosity that he couldn't resist. He took a deep breath and began to move forward, each step echoing in the quiet as he approached the door. When he reached it, he hesitated for a moment, then slowly pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the room was empty, save for an old rocking chair that moved ever so slightly, as if someone had just been sitting there. He swallowed hard, a chill creeping down his spine, and backed out of the room, closing the door behind him. The whisper had stopped, but the silence felt even heavier now, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting. As the traveler descended the stairs, the oppressive silence of the inn seemed to press even closer around him. He felt the weight of unseen eyes tracking his every move. His footsteps echoed hollowly against the wooden floorboards, and he found himself almost wishing for some sound, any sound, to break the tension. When he reached the bottom, he noticed a figure standing in the corner near the fireplace, almost blending in with the shadows. It was a man, his face partially obscured by the dim light, wearing a weathered coat and staring intently into the flames. "Excuse me," the traveler ventured, his voice trembling slightly. The man didn't respond or even acknowledge his presence. The traveler took a cautious step closer. "Do you know where I can find the innkeeper?" he asked. Still no response. The man remained completely motionless, his gaze locked on the flickering fire. Unease gnawed at the traveler's stomach. He stepped back, deciding it was best to leave the inn and search elsewhere for answers. Out on the street, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the fog hung thick in the air, clinging to the buildings like a shroud. He walked down the main road, passing more of the small houses, each with its own peculiar aura of abandonment despite the lights that flickered within. He saw another figure down the road, a woman, standing perfectly still under a lamppost. Encouraged by the sight of another person, he quickened his pace, but as he drew closer, his enthusiasm waned. The woman's eyes were wide, unblinking, staring off into the distance as if in a trance. Her lips were slightly parted, and she seemed to be mouthing words, but no sound came out. "Ma'am," he called out, but she didn't react. She just kept mouthing those silent words, her expression frozen in an eerie calm. He reached out to touch her arm, but stopped himself at the last moment, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. Something was very, very wrong here. The traveler continued down the street, now more anxious than ever. He spotted a small grocery store and pushed the door open, a bell jingling softly above his head. Inside, the shelves were lined with dusty cans and old packages, and there was a faint smell of something rotten. Behind the counter stood an old woman, her hair in a tight bun, her eyes staring straight ahead, unblinking. He approached slowly, the floor creaking under his weight. "Hello? Can you help me?" he asked, his voice cracking. The old woman's gaze didn't waver. She stood as still as a statue, her face devoid of any emotion. He waved a hand in front of her eyes, but there was no reaction. Panic began to set in as he realized that everyone he had encountered seemed to be in the same state, alive but not truly living, as if trapped in some unending silence. He backed away from the counter, the sensation of being watched growing stronger with each passing second. Determined to find someone who could speak to him, the traveler left the store and made his way to what appeared to be the town's main square. As he approached, he saw more people, men, women, and children, all standing in various poses of stillness, some holding hands, others frozen mid-step. All of them had the same vacant, haunted look in their eyes. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the crowd for any sign of life, any indication that he wasn't completely alone in this bizarre nightmare. He spotted a small cafe on the corner, its door slightly ajar. Hoping against hope, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, with a few tables and chairs scattered about. In the far corner, a young boy sat at a table, his hands clasped tightly together as if in prayer. The traveler approached cautiously, not wanting to startle him. "Hey, kid, are you okay?" he asked softly. The boy didn't move, but his eyes slowly shifted to meet the traveler's. There was something in those eyes, something terrified and pleading. The boy's lips began to tremble, and he seemed to struggle to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he raised a finger to his lips in a silent gesture, a universal sign for, "Be quiet." The traveler's blood ran cold. He understood now that there was a reason for the silence, a reason why everyone was so afraid to make a sound. Before he could react, a sudden, loud bang echoed from somewhere outside, shattering the stillness. The boy's eyes widened in terror, and he began to shake uncontrollably. The traveler turned towards the sound, his heart racing. The silence that followed was even more oppressive than before, a heavy, suffocating blanket that settled over the town. And then, from the depths of that silence, he heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down his spine, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The traveler's breath hitched in his throat as the growl reverberated through the town. He glanced back at the boy, whose face was now as white as a sheet, eyes wide with terror. The boy pointed frantically towards the back of the cafe, urging the traveler to hide. Without thinking, he ducked behind the counter, crouching low to the floor, his heart pounding in his ears. The growl grew louder, closer, filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. Peeking over the edge of the counter, he saw shadows moving outside the cafe window, dark, amorphous shapes that slithered and shifted across the glass. He couldn't make out what they were, but they exuded a malevolent energy that made his skin crawl. The traveler pressed himself closer to the floor, trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. He held his breath, praying that whatever was out there wouldn't notice him. The growl subsided, replaced by a deep, rumbling silence that seemed to vibrate through his bones. He dared not move, every muscle in his body tense with fear. Minutes passed like hours, and just when he thought it was safe to come out, a sharp, sudden scream pierced the air, echoing down the empty streets. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, a cry that sent shivers down his spine. He knew he should stay hidden, but something compelled him to see who had screamed. Slowly, cautiously, he crept towards the window, keeping low to the ground. He peered out, and what he saw made his blood run cold. A woman stood in the middle of the square, her face twisted in horror, her hands clutching her throat as if she were being strangled by an invisible force. Her eyes bulged, and her mouth opened in a silent scream, the veins in her neck standing out in stark relief. As he watched, she collapsed to the ground, her body convulsing, and then went still. The traveler felt a surge of panic. He had to get out of this town, away from whatever was happening here. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye, a figure standing in the doorway of one of the houses across the square. It was the old woman from the grocery store, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes were different now, alert, filled with a strange intensity. She raised a finger to her lips, mimicking the boy's gesture from earlier, and then beckoned him to follow her. He hesitated, unsure of whether to trust her, but he had little choice. Keeping low, he darted across the square, his footsteps eerily silent against the cobblestones. As he reached the door, she pulled him inside, shutting it quickly behind him. The interior of the house was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of decay. She led him down a narrow hallway, her step surprisingly sure for someone so frail, and opened a door that led down into a basement. He followed her down the creaky stairs, his nerves on edge. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, but in the center of the room was a large, cracked mirror mounted on the wall. The old woman gestured towards the mirror, her eyes wide with fear. "Look," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Look and you will understand." The traveler approached the mirror cautiously, his reflection distorted in the cracked glass. As he stared into it, the surface began to ripple and shift, like water disturbed by a stone. Images flashed before his eyes, people he had seen in the town, all in various states of fear and anguish. He saw the woman who had screamed, her face contorted in agony, and then the man from the inn, his eyes wide with terror. The mirror showed him scenes of chaos and violence, of people running and hiding, their mouths open in silent screams. He stepped back, shaken. What is this?" he asked, his voice trembling. The old woman shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It shows what was," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what will be if the silence is broken." She explained that the town had once been a thriving community, but a terrible curse had befallen them, a curse that demanded silence. Anyone who made a sound was doomed to suffer a terrible fate, their very soul torn from their body and consumed by the darkness that now haunted the town. The traveler felt a wave of nausea wash over him as the reality of the situation sank in. He had made sounds, he had spoken to the people, called out, even whispered. And now, he had seen what happened to those who broke the silence. He turned to the old woman, desperate for answers. How do we stop it? How do we break the curse? She shook her head sadly. There is no way to break it. Only to survive it. She pointed to a small trapdoor in the corner of the basement. That leads to the old tunnels beneath the town. You might be able to escape that way, if you're careful. He nodded, swallowing hard. And you? What about you? The old woman smiled sadly. I'm too old to run. But you still have a chance. She reached out and touched his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Remember, no matter what you hear, no matter what you see, stay silent. With that, she turned away, leaving him to face the trapdoor and the unknown horrors that awaited him beneath the town. The traveler took a deep breath, his heart hammering in his chest as he approached the trapdoor. He grasped the rusted handle and pulled it open, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel that descended into the earth. A musty, damp smell wafted up from below, and he hesitated for a moment, his instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he knew there was no going back, only forward. With a final glance at the old woman, who was now seated silently by the mirror, he descended into the darkness. The tunnel was cramped, with walls that seemed to close in around him as he moved deeper underground. He could barely see his hand in front of his face, the only light coming from a dim, flickering bulb that hung from the ceiling on a frayed wire. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe, and every step he took sent a shower of dirt and debris raining down from the ceiling. He moved slowly, carefully, trying to keep his movements as quiet as possible, his ears straining for any sound that might indicate he was not alone. As he ventured further, the tunnel began to widen slightly, and he found himself in a small chamber, its walls lined with what appeared to be old mining equipment. Rusted tools and broken carts lay scattered across the floor, and in the center of the room was an old wooden table with a lantern on top. The traveler approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. He picked up the lantern and shook it gently, the dim light flickering to life. The room was bathed in a soft, eerie glow, and that's when he saw it, a map, spread out across the table, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. The traveler leaned in closer, examining the map carefully. It was a layout of the town, with a network of tunnels running beneath it, marked with various notes and symbols. His eyes followed the lines on the map, tracing a path that seemed to lead to a large chamber deep underground, far beneath the town square. Beside it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "The Source." The traveler's mind raced. Could this chamber hold the key to breaking the curse? He folded the map carefully and tucked it into his jacket, gripping the lantern tightly as he made his way back into the tunnel. The air grew colder as he descended deeper into the earth, the silence now a constant companion, pressing in on all sides. He could feel the weight of the darkness around him, an almost physical presence that seemed to grow heavier with each step. After what felt like hours of walking, the tunnel opened up into a vast underground cavern, its ceiling lost in shadows high above. The traveler stopped at the edge, his breath catching in his throat. The cavern was filled with an eerie, phosphorescent light that emanated from strange, glowing crystals embedded in the walls. In the center of the cavern stood a massive stone altar, covered in strange symbols and markings that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly energy. He approached the altar slowly, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. As he drew closer, he could see that the markings on the altar were not random. They formed a pattern, a series of intricate symbols that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. He reached out to touch one of the symbols, his fingers brushing against the cold stone, and immediately felt a jolt of energy surge through his body. He pulled his hand back, shaken, and realized that he had felt something else, a presence, lurking just beyond the edge of his consciousness. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the cavern, soft and whispering, yet somehow filling the entire space. "You should not have come here," it said, its tone almost gentle, but with an undercurrent of menace. The traveler spun around, holding up the lantern, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The voice did not respond immediately, but he could feel its presence all around him, closing in. "Long ago," the voice finally replied, "this town made a pact to protect its people, to keep them safe from what lies beyond. But the pact was broken, and now the price must be paid." The traveler felt a chill run down his spine. "What price?" he asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. The voice laughed softly, a sound that sent shivers through him. "Silence," it whispered. "Only in silence can the darkness be kept at bay. Only in silence can you hope to survive." He took a step back, his mind racing. The town had been cursed to remain silent, trapped in a perpetual state of fear and paranoia, all because of a broken promise. But there had to be a way to end it, to free the people from this nightmare. "How do we break the curse?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the cavern. The voice was silent for a long moment, and then it spoke again, softer this time. "The curse cannot be broken, only transferred. To break the silence is to take it upon yourself. To take the silence is to become the silence." The traveler felt a wave of despair wash over him. If he chose to speak, to break the silence, he would condemn himself to the same fate as the townspeople. But if he remained silent, the curse would continue, and the town would remain trapped in its endless nightmare. He realized now that the true horror was not in the curse itself, but in the choice it forced upon him, a choice between his own freedom and the freedom of others. He glanced back at the tunnel, then at the altar, his mind a whirlwind of fear and indecision. He had come this far, risking everything, but now the weight of the decision bore down on him with a crushing force. As he stood there, the voice spoke one final time, its tone almost sympathetic. "Decide, traveler. But know this, whatever choice you make, there is no turning back." The traveler stood frozen in place, his mind racing with the gravity of the choice before him. The cavern seemed to close in around him, the glow of the crystals casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. His breath was shallow, every muscle in his body tense with fear. He looked at the altar, the symbol still pulsing with a strange, otherworldly energy, and felt a surge of determination. He could not leave these people to their fate. He had to try to help them, no matter the cost. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, approaching the altar once more. He could feel the cold emanating from the stone, the energy pulsing through his veins as he reached out, placing his hands flat against the surface. A shock ran through him, and the symbols on the altar glowed brighter, their light blinding. He closed his eyes against the glare, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm here to end this." For a moment, there was silence, and then the cavern erupted in sound. A deafening roar filled the air, shaking the ground beneath his feet. The traveler staggered back, his hands still on the altar, and opened his eyes to see the symbols shifting, changing shape. The voice returned, louder now, filled with fury. "You dare to defy the pact," it thundered, the words echoing off the walls. "You dare to challenge what has been set in stone?" The traveler's resolve wavered, but he stood his ground. "I won't let this continue," he shouted over the noise. "I won't let you keep them trapped in silence." The voice roared again, a sound of pure rage, and the cavern seemed to darken, the light of the crystals dimming as shadows began to seep from the walls, creeping towards him. He felt a chill run through his body, but he held firm, refusing to back down. As the shadows closed in, he felt a strange calm settle over him. He knew this was it, the moment of decision. He could either accept the curse, taking the silence upon himself, or he could fight, risk everything to break it. He glanced down at the altar, the symbols still glowing faintly, and made his choice. He would fight. With a cry of defiance, he pushed against the altar with all his might. The symbols flared brightly, and the air around him crackled with energy. The shadows recoiled, hissing like serpents, but they did not retreat. The traveler gritted his teeth, his muscles straining as he continued to push. "I will not be silent," he shouted, his voice echoing through the cavern. "I will not let you win." Suddenly, the ground beneath him began to shake violently. The altar cracked, fissures spreading across its surface as if it were about to split in two. The traveler stumbled back, watching in horror as the stone began to crumble, pieces falling away to reveal a swirling vortex of darkness beneath. The voice screamed in fury, a sound that pierced his very soul, but he stood his ground, refusing to be cowed. The darkness swirled around him, tendrils reaching out to grasp at him, but he dodged them, moving towards the edge of the cavern. He could see the tunnel entrance ahead, a glimmer of light beckoning him forward. He sprinted towards it, the ground shaking beneath his feet, the walls of the cavern beginning to collapse. As he reached the tunnel, a tendril of darkness lashed out, wrapping around his ankle and pulling him back. He fell to the ground, his hands scrabbling for purchase as he was dragged towards the vortex. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to remain calm. He reached into his jacket, pulling out the map, and threw it into the vortex. The darkness recoiled, the tendril loosening its grip, and he took his chance, scrambling to his feet and racing for the tunnel entrance. He could hear the voice behind him, screaming in rage, but he didn't look back. He plunged into the tunnel, running as fast as his legs would carry him, the walls shaking around him, rocks falling from the ceiling. He stumbled and nearly fell several times, but he kept going, driven by a desperate need to escape. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, but finally, he saw a light ahead, the faint glow of daylight. He burst out of the tunnel, collapsing onto the ground outside, gasping for breath. The town lay before him, still shrouded in fog, but now there was something different, a sense of stillness, of quiet. He pushed himself to his feet, looking around in confusion. The townspeople were emerging from their homes, blinking in the light, their expressions dazed. The traveler's heart swelled with hope. Had he done it? Had he broken the curse? But as he watched, he realized something was wrong. The people were not celebrating, they were silent, their faces drawn and fearful. He took a step forward, and a wave of unease washed over him. He had broken the silence, but he had not freed them. He had only taken the curse upon himself. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had saved them, yes, but at what cost? He could feel the weight of the silence settling over him, pressing down on his chest, choking the air from his lungs. He opened his mouth to speak, to call out to them, but no sound came. He was trapped, just as they had been, bound by the curse he had tried so hard to break. The traveler sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He had done it, he had saved them. But he was lost, condemned to an eternity of silence. As the townspeople watched, their eyes filled with sorrow, he closed his eyes and let the darkness take him, knowing that he had done what he had set out to do. He had broken the curse. He had set them free. And now, he would pay the price.